Stories that time forgot.
No one in Manaus knew that the most luxurious opera house in South America was built with the sweat of 100,000 enslaved indigenous people until a Silesian missionary published photographs of their corpses piled next to rubber trees along the Purus River, the rubber monopoly that enslaved entire continents. On December 16, 1899, the Amazonas Theater in Manaus opened its season with Carlos Gomes Il Guarani before an audience of European aristocrats dressed in silk suits brought directly from Paris. If you had been there, you would have walked on Carrara marble floors and under a dome of 36,000 vitrified tiles, shimmering under the tropical sun. The stage, lit by Murano crystal lamps, glowed beneath a dome covered with 24,000 tiles enameled in the colors of the Brazilian flag. Outside the theater, the Amazon rainforest teemed with life. But among the Hevea brasiliensis rubber trees, hundreds of miles upriver, another spectacle occurred in silence. Indigenous men with iron collars around their necks slashed the bark of trees with rusted machetes, collecting latex for 18 hours a day while their families died of malaria and hunger in camps without drinking water. The Amazonas Theater was not built with money. It was built with lives. 100,000 lives. According to the fragmentary records of missionaries who tried to count the dead of the Amazonian rubber boom, the rubber monopoly did not have a single owner. Like Leopold II's Congo, it had hundreds of feudal lords called Seringalistas who controlled territorial concessions the size of European countries in the Amazon basin. But they all obeyed a common logic. Wild rubber only grew in the western Amazon, and its collection required massive labor under lethal conditions. The Seringalistas solved the problem through a system of slavery disguised as perpetual debt. Recruiters called aviadores traveled to northeastern Brazilian states like Ceará, Pernambuco, or Maranhão, where recurring droughts left peasants without land or hope. They offered them free passage on steamboats to Manaus with the promise of easy wealth in the rubber forests. The peasants accepted, signing contracts they never read. Upon arriving at the rubber estates, they discovered the truth. They had to pay a passage fee of 400,000 reis, tools for 200,000 reis, the first month's food for 300,000 reis, and hut rent for 50,000 reis. The initial debt totaled 950,000 reis. The monthly wage was a mere 150,000 reis. The debt was mathematically impossible to pay off, and the Seringalistas knew it perfectly well. Imagine being trapped in a green labyrinth with no possible exit. The control mechanism was brutally simple. Each estate had its own currency, metal or wooden tokens that only had value at the boss's store. Workers received tokens as payment and had to use them to buy food, clothing, and medicine at prices inflated 300% above the market. A kilo of flour cost 5 times more at the estate store than in Manaus. A bottle of quinine for malaria cost the equivalent of 2 weeks' work. Workers who tried to flee were hunted by armed overseers called rubber soldiers. If caught, they received 50 lashes, and the cost of their capture was added to their accumulated debt. If they resisted, they were executed, and their bodies were left in the jungle as a warning to others. The indigenous people suffered an even worse fate. They were captured through carreras, armed expeditions that razed entire villages, and were forced to work with iron collars connected by 2-meter chains. Indigenous children were separated from their mothers and sold as servants in Manaus. Women were systematically raped by overseers under the cover of absolute impunity. The epicenter of this slavery machine was the Purus River Valley. In what is now the state of Acre, there operated the most feared Seringalista in the Amazon, the Portuguese Luís Galvez Rodrigues de Arias, who in 1897 unilaterally declared the independence of Acre as the Republic of Acre to prevent Brazil From imposing labor regulations, Galvez ruled as a feudal despot. His private army of 300 men patrolled the rivers, executing anyone who questioned his authority. Under his rule, the Purrs became a riverine hell. Steamboats transported not only rubber, but the corpses of workers who died of exhaustion thrown into the river. To avoid burial, local fishermen learned to avoid certain stretches of the river because decomposing bodies contaminated the drinking water. But the true architect of the monopoly was not a Seringalista. It was a British botanist named Henry Wickham. In 1876, Wickham smuggled 70,000 Hevea brasiliensis seeds from the Brazilian Amazon to Kew Gardens in London. The seeds germinated. The British cultivated them on plantations in Malaysia and Ceylon using Tamil labor imported under conditions barely better than Brazilian slavery. By 1900, Asian plantations produced rubber cheaper and of better quality than wild Amazonian rubber. The world price collapsed from 12 shillings a pound in 1895 to 3 shillings in 1908. Amazonian Seringalistas, unable to compete, intensified exploitation to maintain profit margins. Workers had to collect twice the latex for the same misery wage. Deaths multiplied exponentially. Between 1900 and 1912, the Amazonian rubber boom collapsed economically, but its human legacy endured. 100,000 dead, exterminated indigenous peoples, and a devastated region that never fully recovered from the trauma. The first crack in the silence came in 1910. American journalist Sidney Paternoster published a book based on survivor testimonies describing in detail the querellas against indigenous people and the system of perpetual debt. The European press ignored the book. Asian rubber had already replaced Amazonian rubber in global markets, and there was no interest in denouncing the past. But in Brazil, a young lawyer named Euclides da Cunha read the book and traveled to Acre in 1909 to investigate. He found entire villages depopulated, abandoned rubber fields with sun-bleached skeletons next to the trees, and indigenous elders who still bore deep marks from iron collars on their necks. Da Cunha wrote a series of articles in the newspaper O Estado de São Paulo titled The Agony of the Seringueiro, which moved the Brazilian intelligentsia. But the federal government, pressured by the powerful rubber exporters of Manaus, shelved the complaints. Da Cunha died in 1909, killed in a duel over personal matters before he could press for legal reforms. The true definitive testimony came from the Catholic Church. In 1912, Salesian Bishop Dom Luiz Antonio de Castro y Silva sent Italian missionary Ezequiel Gaboto to evangelize the tribes of the Juruá River. Gaboto found no souls to save. He found slaves to free. For 3 years, Gaboto systematically documented conditions on the rubber estates. He took photographs of workers with lash scars, recorded testimonies from captured indigenous people, and counted corpses in mass graves along the rubber trails. In 1915, he returned to Rome with an album of 120 photographs and a 300-page report. Pope Benedict XV read the report and ordered its partial publication in the Vatican City newspaper. The photographs of indigenous corpses piled like firewood shocked Europe. But it was too late. The boom was already over. The Seringalistas had abandoned their concessions and returned to Manaus with accumulated fortunes. The survivors were left abandoned in the jungle without land, without tools, and without rights. Today, the Amazonas Theater still stands in the center of Manaus, restored and turned into a tourist attraction. Visitors marvel at its opulence, unaware that every Italian marble tile was paid for with indigenous blood. The descendants of the Seringueiros now live in favelas on the outskirts of the city, many without access to basic services. The indigenous peoples who survived the querellas fight today for the demarcation of their lands against ranchers and loggers who repeat colonial patterns. The cycle of exploitation was never broken. It only changed form and technology. You feel the weight of that history when you look at the photos of the past. But the history of Amazonian rubber contains a forgotten lesson. Monopolies do not require a single owner to function. They can emerge from hundreds of individual actors united by a common economic logic that normalizes slavery as a cost of production. The Seringallistas did not consider themselves slaveholders. They saw themselves as innovative entrepreneurs civilizing the jungle. The aviadores did not see themselves as human traffickers. They saw themselves as recruiters offering opportunities to the poor of the Northeast. This banalization of evil is more dangerous than explicit tyranny because it allows ordinary people to commit atrocities without feeling guilty. The executioner doesn't need to be a monster. It's enough for him to believe he is just doing his daily job under the sweltering tropical heat. Think about the objects you touch every morning when you wake up. This is the reflection. That should resonate every time you use a product derived from rubber. If you knew the material came from a supply chain where workers earn less than a living wage and lack basic labor rights, would you change your habits even if it cost you 20% more money? Or would you prefer to maintain comfortable ignorance, knowing your comfort depends on the invisible suffering of others on the other side of the world? Because modern slavery doesn't use visible iron collars. It uses debt contracts, misery wages, and the silent complicity of consumers who choose not to ask where what they buy comes from. History teaches us that silence is the best ally of injustice. Do you believe technological progress justifies the sacrifice of human lives in remote regions, or should we demand total transparency in what we consume? Leave us your answer in the comments because your opinion is very important to us. And we want to know what you would have done in the place of those who raised their voices. Like and subscribe to discover more stories time forgot.